me at Cello, Cello. You had me at Cello. You had me at Cello. Oh, you had me at. Good afternoon, everybody. 5 o'clock on a Friday. Time for another episode of Cello Chat. With me this week is Dr. Lisa Caravan. How are things, Lisa?
They're great. It's great to be here and meet with you and talk with you today. Thanks for having me.
Oh, I'm very much looking forward to it. So can you begin by telling your musical background? What even drew you to cello in the first place?
Yeah, I am very fortunate to come from a very musical family. Both of my parents actually went to Fredonia for music, and my father's a clarinet and saxophonist, and my mother is a pianist. So when they had children, they had the intention of all of us learning instruments, but string instruments, actually, not wind or brass instruments, but they were particularly interested in string. And so I have two older sisters who started violin prior to me, and I was the youngest. And I was hearing all of this Suzuki violin music around me and singing the songs. And so at 3 years old, I wanted to play and be like my sisters. So I started violin when I was very young. What was I playing? Maybe I was just having fun with the violin, well, alongside my sisters. And so a few years went by, and our teacher, we all had the same teacher. Her name is Muriel Bodley. I grew up in the Syracuse, New York area. And she was our Suzuki teacher who did group classes with us at a nearby local college. And she said to my mother, she's like, I think one of the girls needs to switch to cello. And so I was, here I am not knowing, but they decided to approach my older sister, the middle one. Would you like to switch to cello? And at this point, she's 9 years old. And she responded with, no, I'm too good on the violin. And so they're like, okay, Lisa's being switched to cello. And so I was 6, and so they switched me to cello. But also the story is, whenever I was playing the violin, I would move away from the teacher as much as I could during the lesson. Like I would back up from her. And so now they sat me down with a cello, and I couldn't move anymore around like that. And I'm so thankful that happened, though, because I just, I absolutely love the sounds of the cello. And that range for me is that's really where my heart lies, in terms of that low range in particular. And I have my cello is pretty dark and has those qualities that I just love so much. So it's a funny story how I became a cellist, but in the end, I'm really thankful for the switch.
Great. And then your training?
Yeah, so I actually studied with Jeffrey Solo at Temple University for my undergraduate degree. And he had such a powerful influence on me because when I went to him, I had so much tension in my playing. And I was playing pieces like Haydn and C, in high school, and I was working on, the Popper etudes, standard literature. And when I went to him, he said, number one, you're playing on a cello that is too big for you. So I just bought a new cello, which I always tell students now, don't ever buy a cello before you go directly into your undergrad, because you never know what the teacher's going to say. And Jeffrey Solo was like, no, this cello is too big for you. I mean, it's a gorgeous cello, but it's not going to work for you. I'm only 5'1.5". So he had legitimate concerns. And so he said, I will find you a cello. And of course, in Jeffrey Solo style, he flew to California to Robert Cower, and he found an instrument for me that was in my price range. And that's a cello actually I still play on today. And it's a 7/8 size cello. And I've had work done on it over the years to open up the sound in many different ways. But he really took me that first semester and said, well, you're going to be playing open strings for a lot of it. And as a first year in college, I was like, wait, what? I came to college, what? But in all honesty, it's exactly what I needed. I've been thinking about, when I'm working with students, what do they really need at the time when they come to me? And at that point, and I think, I needed that time to connect with what was happening with my body, which I think a lot of the times, probably in high school, I was just like going towards the next goal, whatever that may be, whether that's playing, in a concerto competition, whether that's doing a chamber music recital in an organization I was playing in, or, youth orchestra, all of these things. There was always this goal, kind of a repertoire goal that was guiding me, maybe instead of me really connecting my playing with how I was feeling with my body. And Jeffrey Solo really worked on that with me in many ways. Sometimes I would have a 2-hour lesson. He wouldn't let me walk out of his studio until I really understood the concept and I knew how to work on it in the practice room. So I really value that experience. After that, I did teach a public school in the Rochester, New York area in a situation where I was the cello and bass specialist. So I taught all cello and bass lessons from grades 4 through 9 in a school district where I traveled between 6 buildings. And I say that, and people have that reaction. And I said, yeah, there are some benefits though, because you don't get assigned other kind of duties when you're at just one school. So I really got to work with a lot of students, and I had longevity with those students. So I could really work myself as a new teacher at that point and how to grow my curriculum for those instruments. And I did conducting as well, 5th grade orchestra district-wide, and then a 9th grade orchestra in that particular position. But my part of what I really wanted to do was still go back to do my master's, and in particular in performance only. My undergrad was both performance and education, which is a very busy degree, a music education degree. I wouldn't have changed that decision in any way, because learning to better my playing, as well as understanding the pedagogue, the pedagogy behind learning, really has shaped my particular career. And so I knew at this point, this junction, I really wanted to just focus on that performance and my playing in that capacity. So I was very fortunate that Alan Harris accepted me into his studio at Eastman School of Music. So I did my master's in performance there with actually an Orchestral Studies Diploma that they were offering at the same time, where I had the opportunity to essentially intern with the Rochester Philharmonic Orchestra. We played 10 concerts a season with them. So this idea of learning to do this in, a practical application, and studying with the assistant principal for orchestral excerpts, Kathy Kemp, really actually gave me a glimpse into that world as well, which is really helpful to my understanding of how do you prepare for auditions and that process. So I ended up staying at Eastman to do a DMA, a Doctor of Musical Arts in Music Education. So this is very unique to some schools. Eastman is one of them. Usually it's either a DMA in performance and literature, or it's a PhD, which is essentially a writing heavy degree and research heavy degree in music education. But I had the opportunity at Eastman and fuse both of those kind of worlds into one degree. So I was having the opportunity to still play solo and lecture and a lecture recital. And then I also did, I would say, a scaled back dissertation, not at quite the same length and level as somebody that's doing a PhD. So that's kind of my schooling. And then I left the nest, as they like to say, the school, the education bubble. And I had I kind of found my way down south. I taught in Auburn University for my first higher ed position. And that was really eye-opening because I was kind of the string person, like string person in a small department. I was teaching a lot of violin at the time, actually. I inherited kind of a pre-collegiate studio with a lot of violinists, and I created a pre-collegiate studio of cellists. But wow, that was an eye-opening experience to be, where I was teaching violin repertoire and learning that side of things as well. And then I kind of made my way back to the north. I taught at Bucknell University, where I was doing music education and applied lessons, especially cello. And I started restarted the chamber music program there and had a great opportunity to bring in so many wonderful artists and string quartets to work with our students there. And then most recently coming back to Eastman as a faculty member, where my focus gets to be all of the time string music education, string pedagogy, and this kind of thing, working with student teachers, but also performance majors in my classes. So that's a lot of it in a nutshell, kind of.
Yeah, tremendous. And on your website, your title is Assistant Professor of Music Teaching and Learning, which I like a lot. I mean, I think we, at least anecdotally, have heard of a number of people who were music teachers. They taught music, and some of them more successfully than others, but maybe in part because of the increase in what we know of the neuroscience of the way that we learn. So to be a professor of teaching and learning, can you talk about how, from your perspective, does that affect the way that you think about, all right, here's the things I want to convey to the student, and here's me putting myself in the student's shoes, looking at this material?
Yeah, I think when Eastman made the decision to change the name of the department from music education to music teaching and learning, and they were really trying to think about not pigeonholing the department in one area.
Uh-huh.
When you think about music education, a lot of people, and myself included, go towards, I'm learning how to teach in a very specific context. And that context is usually public school, it could be private, magnet schools, but it's very much a specific kind of context and path. And I think through the years and through my experiences as well, I mean, music teaching and learning doesn't happen in just this small context. It happens in many different ways. And it really, we are all kind of teaching and learning each other, whether you're faculty, whether you're a student, whether you're a collaborating teacher that works with our students and collaborating mentors. So I think it's trying to encompass what our community is. And this idea of, I'm going to mention a book by Robert Duke, Intelligent Music Teaching. Have you delved into that book at all?
Yes.
I think everyone should read it. That's even as a new parent, I think of that book. I have a 7-month-old, and I'm just watching her learn. And I got to be honest, she likes to learn independently of what I'm trying to teach. And I noticed this from the very beginning, and it made me pause again to think about, I have an idea of how I've experienced teaching and teaching young children, teaching more advanced students, and I might have a certain way that I like to approach it, and I had teachers that had a certain way that they wanted to approach it. But how can we think about, what does the student bring already? How does the student process information? And this idea of exploration and their exploration is maybe their way to learning something. Because I like this idea that if you just lecture at somebody, you have no idea actually what they're taking in or maybe what they're learning. You're talking a lot, right?
Yeah.
But what are they actually learning, and how are they transferring that learning to other areas? I hear a lot in the college, like who loves to take music theory, right? I've heard it all, but when we really think about us developing our own musicality and working on pieces, I hope we're thinking about music theory in that process. But I think it's sometimes hard to bring those connections all the time very clearly to students until they really have an experience where they need that, right? So I think this idea of teaching and learning have to go together, because we can try to teach, right? But there's not necessarily learning.
Nice. In the way you describe that, it makes me think of, you have a video on YouTube about the path of the bow arm, and the rate at which you're talking about feeling the weight of your arm and do this and notice this, and even the pace at which you kind of allow this to go on. You're really experiencing what you're describing in real time, rather than the tendency sometimes during a lecture to go at a pace that clearly indicates the person speaking knows it inside and out, and now wait, I better take good notes because now I somehow have to catch up to that.
And that is that processing. So leaving that time for processing. I think I got this from both of my teachers, Jeffrey Solo and Alan Harris. Jeff really describes it as experiential exercises. That's the terminology that he uses to describe this. So I can't say, I know what you're feeling inside of your body. I can pick up on some cues, perhaps, right, from a student. But I can't necessarily say, oh, is that person actually releasing all the time? You can't actually always tell if they're releasing their muscles or letting them beat you, and you can't release them completely, or your arms will be completely at the side, right? And I have I have a student right now who I actually teach on Zoom. And I sometimes see her in person, but we're mainly on Zoom because she was at Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, where Bucknell was, and I kind of kept this one student. And I go and visit her every so often, and she is one of the most tense students I have ever had in my life, and it makes me upset a little bit, like, because here's Jeffrey Solo working on, getting my bow arm released, and also with Alan Harris, and she holds her body in her daily life in a very tense way. And I had a colleague of mine watching a video that she sent of her playing Arioso, and she's like getting this nice vibrato and all of these things. And I was like, so she's really tense all the time. And they're like, oh, they couldn't immediately see it without me saying something, right? Because when I go up to this student in person and just like, let me check out what's happening here and here, it's very hard. And so it's been a journey with her to, she's motivated, she loves it, and she's trying so hard. And then sometimes that has nothing, that's like the mental aspect or just how they carry themselves, right? Yeah. And to say, hey, what about you do some yoga to try to make connection? I go back to that same thing. I think maybe I'm resonating with her as a high school student because I wasn't connected. I wasn't aware of my body. I wasn't aware. And so, there's this, we like Cello Bello for sure. And we're glad that they took over the Internet Cello Society. But I, reference this kind of quote from an article that I, was reading up on there. And it says the standard of one's playing is determined by the standard of one's practice. So they have some suggestions, and they say the standard of one's practice is determined by the standard of one's. And the first one is monitoring and then questioning, oral and visual, concentration, awareness, self-examination, and organization. And I was like, oh, yeah. And I think about this idea of becoming more efficient in the practice room. I mean, when I went to do my master's with Alan Harris, he said, you'll practice 6 to 8 hours a day. And I did, because I was studying with Alan Harris. And I will say I really was motivated to improve and take that time. Was it necessarily always effective practice? I'm probably going to say a big no to that, because I don't know if I was always clued in to this list of always monitoring, observing what I'm doing, and to be able to then problem solve in the practice room. And so this is really a focus of mine when I think about reading, literature by Robert Duke, and thinking about how we want to always say, I want my student to become independent of me. That's a goal. And I think it's a goal of a lot of teachers with whatever context they're working in. But how do we move to getting them to be independent, right? It's not necessarily let's just throw a kid in the water and they're going to know how to swim, right? And so this idea of how do we help our students to become more aware of what they're actually doing in the practice room. And it's hard. It's hard. And I'm saying I maybe still haven't mastered it. Sometimes when I'm practicing, I'm thinking about, 20 other things, maybe 50. And so how do we focus in on our minds in this kind of way to become more aware of what's physically happening with our body, but what's also mentally happening?
Yeah, that high schooler that you mentioned, the things like hide and C major, and particularly the outer movements, you play them fast and it's so many notes and they're high and there's thumb position, and it's so much information that even if they were doing their very best to focus on what their body felt like and was doing, it's not easy. That, Jeff's thing of the open strings, as much as sometimes it can immediately seem like, oh, really, just open strings? No. There's so much to be paying attention to with just what your right arm is doing if there's no distractions from the left.
Yeah. And I've really pivoted with our lessons. I've made a pivot to saying, we're going to work on technique. We're going to work on these exercises that really start, that's our focus. And we have limited time. And honestly, right now for us and our coming to a decision that we really want to focus on, as my student and I, we're focusing more on those exercises and lessons than necessarily repertoire. And that's very opposite of my experience in high school. But it's funny. She talks to the other students in her youth orchestra on her high school, and she tells them what she's, doing with me in lessons. And it's so funny. She's like, yeah, no one's really doing technique. And so then I tell them what kind of exercise. There was a girl in her youth orchestra that was really struggling to have a lot of notes under one bow. And we got to work on the bow. As we all know, where does the bow go and how much weight, how much speed, all of this. And so we were working on an exercise, my student and I, and she shared that exercise with the students sitting next to her in the youth orchestra, to just be like, well, maybe work on this, because she has seen a benefit of doing these in her own playing. But it really took a pivot and trusting, again, I guess I'm stuck on the word process today in this talk, trusting her being able to trust the process as well, and not to be too motivated just by the repertoire. Yeah.
Interesting. Well, now, so you mentioning repertoire, that makes a good segue to talking about let's see, you have cello teaching repertoire project along with another past guest of this series, Daniel Ketter.
Yeah.
Would you talk about that project a bit?
Yeah, I will. I think Dan and I both were talking one day, and we work with a lot of students that are in this kind of, I would say, intermediate to early advanced, levels. And we were talking about how we find that there is repertoire for this level. There is. We're very lucky to have all sorts of different sonatas that we can work with. Baroque sonatas. We have others that we can sequence into our curriculum. But we also were thinking, well, how can we get past this? Because sometimes we as teachers might want to teach something other than the standard pieces or standard concertos. I know for me as a student, I spent a long time learning the Lalo concerto, the first movement. And I hear this concerto a lot. People play it for auditions. I mean, it's out there, it's played, it's a worthy piece, but I'm also thinking, well, what else can I assign to a student that maybe is not just those standard pieces? And I think Dan and I said, well, why don't we try to start commissioning new music specifically for this this range of players, depending on the year, on whether it's going to be a little bit more advanced or maybe a little bit less. And we decided to put together a consortium model that was based on a group called the New Flute Consortium. And they've been going for many years. And they have, Valerie Coleman is a composer that has done work with them. And we decided, okay, we're gonna give it a try, because we kind of thought that maybe there are other cello teachers out there with similar goals and similar views on saying, how can we get our students to experience just a more plethora of different types of music and composers, so that even when they get to college, whether they're majoring in music or minoring, that they've had maybe just a little bit more breadth of an experience with repertoire. And it's not to say that we want to get rid of standard repertoire. It's this idea of expanding and building. And so these pieces aren't necessarily as long as something that's standard. So it can be a great addition to a recital, or that's a shorter piece, like 5 to 8 minutes. And we were really lucky to commission two composers our first year. Curtis Stewart is one of them. He's actually a violinist. He was recently nominated for the Grammy Award. He played actually his solo violin, Isn't She Lovely? Improvisation kind of piece that he arranged and composed, or arranged for that. And we also, his piece is called Lament. And then we also had another composer, Andrea Casarebus, who is a cellist and pianist actually as well. And she wrote this beautiful piece called Silbo for cello and piano. And it's based on the whistling language that she from her culture. And so there's a lot of false harmonics. Actually, the melody is played with false harmonics. And I was thinking, okay, wait a second. I didn't do false harmonics in my own playing until Shostakovich Piano Trio. And I'm thinking, that's a really scary place to learn false harmonics for the first time. And so I was like, oh, how wonderful that here's this piece where I could introduce false harmonics to my students earlier than the Shostakovich. And it's a kind of a concert piece that showcases the cello in such a nice way. And it sounds hard in some places, but it's not actually that hard. And
Nice.
what's exciting is Thomas Mesa, I think, is going to be doing a recording of that piece eventually on an album that he's going to put out. So that's really exciting. Last year, we had Malcolm Parson, who used to be in the Turtle Island String Quartet, and now he's really doing composing and actually film composing a lot. And he wrote a piece for us last year, and then we're excited to have another 2 composers right this year. One, we're really gearing towards Suzuki book level 4. So we're trying, the first 2 years were a little bit advanced, right? And then we try to kind of go down, and now we're kind of going either side. We're going a little bit more, I guess, easy and a little bit more difficult with the pieces we're doing. But I think I'm excited because this is something I want to introduce to my student, especially this year. And I know Dan has been doing this a lot with his students at his collegiate position. And we also have the opportunity to have these composers workshop their piece in the summer with the Eastman Cello Institute.
That's very cool.
Yeah, it's this connecting composer with a teacher and a student, I think, is really powerful and can be such an amazing experience for all 3.
Mm-hmm.
And, I was thinking about, the collaboration piece of what we do as musicians is really one of the things that guides me in what I like to do in my own performing and playing and teaching, that I'm always learning in these situations where I get to play with other people, where I'm teaching. I learn from the students just as much as they're hopefully learning, and it really motivates me to continue to think about ideas and how to challenge myself and challenge students to, learn different things.
That's excellent. Yeah, it's a great point too. It's a great project. So if one pokes around on IMSLP or Silverberg, or just even some books of less well-known cello repertoire, and there are just dozens and dozens and dozens of great sonatas, but those are a certain length. And I mean, you can play just one movement of something, but it's even then, some of those are still pretty long, and it's still only one movement of something. But the popularity of our standalone things like Allegro Appassionato and Elegy and Kol Nidre and The Swan, I think, is proof of the need for shorter of that intermediate to kind of the cusp of advanced.
Yeah. I think people, they're easy to put on programs. They're easy if you want to have a shorter program, and they connect really well to your audiences. I think that's another important piece. We're, hopefully we're learning and playing to connect with audiences in the end, to share this music. So I know for me, what I've noticed is in some contexts, the 2-hour recital is kind of not happening, I would say, as much in some places. And so it's a great little piece to put on a program that might connect to your audience in a different way.
Terrific. All right. So now one of your research interests is 21st century practice. So what is 21st century practice? I think
so a project that I've been working on with a colleague down at Auburn University, I mentioned I was there before. Her name is Nancy Berry. We have talked to several applied teachers at the collegiate level. And one of our, kind of questions is kind of, what does it take to be a musician in this kind of time, this kind of 21st century? And are the skills the same as they once were? when you think about who you're trying to help become a musician in our landscape, right? And some of the things that came out was we have a very competitive landscape. You have to be if you're going to be a performing musician, you've got to be able to play, right? You've got to be able to kind of be accurate, be musical, and be consistent. And then if you think about, let's say you're going towards a higher ed kind of position, well, it's so competitive, and tenure track positions are kind of going by the wayside in terms of they're just not being offered as much. I'm seeing a lot of professors of practice, which are like a 3-year contract with renewal possibilities. And so this idea of what are the kind of skills that we need in order to, and we need to teach to our students in order to be able to be successful. And that's determined by what they're interested in. You know, successful can look in so many different ways. A lot of teachers were noting that there's a lot of innovation happening in careers in the 21st century, that there are a lot of actual chamber groups or chamber organizations that are being put together, and different instrumentation. And this is kind of what is maybe at the forefront more so than symphony orchestra positions. And you just see the climate of what's happening with different orchestras and contracts that are up or that need to change. And we say, where are the jobs? What kind of jobs do people even want? And, obviously the COVID pandemic really put a bright light on this when things with performing really changed and still have changed the landscape. So, a lot of these participants talked about how learning social media, but learning how to manage social media and your website presence and entrepreneurship skills are something that they didn't have to worry about when they were learning to be in this career as well. So that's something that is very much at the forefront when we talk about 21st century. Well, if we're talking about adding all these other skills that students need, okay, or that we need, right, then how much time can they really be in the practice room? And what is actually healthy for their bodies mentally, and how do they become efficient and effective practicers in this space when we're almost in this age of information overload? You can get overloaded by all the things you can read or experience, or what are the students actually spending their time doing? So this is what the study is really focusing on, is what do these teachers in particular believe are the essential skills to, wanting to do this. And some people said just the love, you have to have a love for this career and the passion for this career. Some also said you have to have, one person was like, well, I can't pick one. And so, she was kind of saying you have to be able to do it, so it's those musicianship skills. You have to have versatility, diversification. That is one thing that's really coming out, being able to, basically do, yes, classical music, but maybe also jazz, or maybe also pop, being able to do these different genres in terms of performing, and also having communication skills. So it's how do we get more efficient in the practice room? And how, again, they all said, I want our students to be independent learners. It's a theme, right? And I believe it. But how do we go about that? And it is something that we've been exploring in this. So I think when we think about the 21st century landscape and what it looks like, maybe we need to think about how do we respond differently, even in our studios, of how we're preparing students. it's very interesting because we talk to not only string teachers, but we also talk to piano, and we talk to some brass and woodwinds. And it was interesting. One participant talked about, well, in order to get them to start making connections on, here's something hard that I need to practice. And he says, you're going to come up with 15 ways to practice that. You're going to take an index card and you're going to come back with 15 ways. And he said to us, it was hard for them to come up with 5. Mm. So again, we may be talking about practicing in our lessons with them and how to practice something, but how are they transferring that knowledge or applying that knowledge when they're going into that practice room? And are they aware that there's maybe a problem that they need to address? I think that's also a question. So I've used some of the ideas from this study to implement in the Cello Institute. My main role is actually kind of being a practice coach in this setting, where the students are coming for 3 weeks, and it's intensive. They're doing 3 different recitals. In the process of doing solo repertoire, they are doing sonatas or other pieces with piano. They do a cello ensemble concert as well. And it can be very overwhelming because they're getting all this information from technique classes that they're like, oh, I want to apply right now, and it's so much to process in such a short amount of time. But something that I tried this past summer was to say, okay, we're going to come up with a strategic plan that you're going to think about what are 3 goals. And one has to be a body awareness, right? Really, connected to how you're feeling, connecting to the body. One was repertoire specific. And then one, they kind of they thought about what they were learning in technique class, and they chose. So it was very individual for each student. And what I found is we don't know how, we don't really know, or they don't really know how to map the steps from point A to point B, right? And there can be so many steps involved that they haven't even considered. Right. So they want to get to just playing the piece, but what's all the stuff before it that could really help you gain comfort? And like I was thinking about your comment about the Haydn and see, the first and third movement, how much can you work on actually before getting to even that piece and playing through it, that you are focused on connecting it to how you're playing and how you're feeling with the body. And I think a lot of us do this in our practicing, and we've done it for so many years, but showing a student to move through that process, I think is a different thing. And then the third column of this is accountability, which is the hardest thing, right? Mm-hmm. Is to have accountability. And so I would ask them to pair up, to have like a little buddy in the camp, because a lot of them was like, well, I'm just so tense. The tension thing comes out a lot. So they're tense in their bow arm, or they feel like, they get the comment, they're holding tension in their shoulder. And I said, okay, so that's going to be one goal. We can think about these exercises that you can do to address it, but you have to ask your practice partner to look specifically for that at the end of the day when you've practiced. And don't ask them to look at anything else, because this is what you said before. We get distracted so easily, right? Because there are so many things that we're trying to think about when we're playing, that we then sometimes the students lose sight of the progress that they have made. And I think one thing that I did too that really helped this idea about monitoring was I would use some of our time together to do a video recording of a short thing. But I would ask first, what do you want to be better? We're going to do one phrase. And this one student picked the opening of the Brahms E minor. All right. And she just didn't like her sound yet. She didn't like her sound. And I was like, okay, well, what don't you like about it? So let's get more specific, let's be more specific. And she just didn't feel like it was open or resonant. And I was like, okay, so you're going to play it 2 times, and you're going to play it once, and then we're going to do it again. You're going to just try to change it, try to change something. And so I videotaped it, right, on my iPad. Technology is great. And I let her listen to it first between the first 2 recordings. I just had her listen. And I didn't ask her to give me any feedback yet. And then I actually ended up turning the sound down, and I had her watch it. And I said, what changed between the first one and the second one? And she saw a change in how she was releasing her arm coming in from the up bow to the down bow. And I said, okay, so which recording did you like better? And it was the second one that she thought sounded better. But it was so interesting. I had to focus her so much on really narrowing in, because when I asked her, I made a mistake the first time. And I asked her, I'm like, oh, what did you notice? She's like, well, it's so out of tune, and I missed that shift. And she went to all these areas that was not the focus that she said she wanted. So once she could understand and make that connection and see what she did with her body, she was like, oh, okay, so now I see that I need to do that more. Now, does she need to continually do that outside the time that I worked with her in that setting? Of course. But it's this idea of like, when we're actually doing something, it's hard to also be an objective, like we're watching ourselves as objectively as possible to say, what am I noticing? So I can actually say, oh, maybe it worked better this way. What was I doing? And looking at it just visually. I thought, that really seemed to be effective.
Outstanding. Moment. Yeah, that's exciting stuff. And just no matter how deep you go, there's always more.
always more to try.
Yeah. All right. Well, obviously you've answered this question to a certain extent in terms of your projects irons you've gotten to fire and such, but what other projects are yet to be done in 2023? Performances?
Yeah, well, I've had a really a great opportunity to perform with kind of 2 different groups. One is a chamber music society called the Northeastern Chamber Music Society. It's run by John Vida and his wife, Amy. And John Vida is teaching at Mansfield University and also is in Lycoming, and they live in the area it's near Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. And he, had this vision of bringing more classical music to this area. And so with advocacy for chamber music and classical music and this idea, he's been running this organization for many years, and I've had the opportunity to play with them recently. And we actually did a string quartet concert this past March. And I was thinking about what inspires me to when I'm practicing, and it's like really chamber music is one of those things that I think can be one of the most special and exciting, places to just create and design musicality, but also to be spontaneous in the moment and to respond to each other. I think it's one of the I think it's one of the greatest things for me, because you get to be kind of in the driver's seat sometimes, or your supporting role. Yeah. And, you can change your mind in the moment. You don't necessarily have to do exactly like you rehearsed, unless, your players get a little, upset at you. But I think, we played a program, Philip Glass, and we did Philip Glass, and we did also Shostakovich 8, and then Beethoven, Opus 59, number 1. And it was a big program, but moving through those pieces and, all different, stylistically, I think the audience was so connected in different ways. to that kind of program. And I know for us, just the raw emotion of those pieces that, that you can kind of be vulnerable and show the audience was something that we love doing. And we got to do the performance more than once, which is always a great thing, because you're learning in that moment and performing at different venues. And so doing a lot of chamber music with them, we had the opportunity to do the Trout Quintet with J.B. Vandermark from Eastman. Nice. And he's so great because he's a collaborator. He knows how to lift up players and support them, but also challenge them. And I think when you have that combination with players, it's really an exciting time. The other thing that I do quite often is play with this group called the Paragon Ragtime Orchestra. Oh, yeah. They're actually kind of a group that specializes in early American music. So this playing has taught me how precise I have to be. And so in solo playing or in chamber music, you're coming up with these decisions as a player. And because a lot of this work with Paragon Ragtime, you're playing with silent films, you are completely glued to the conductor stick. And you might have the most lyrical melody, but it's got to be in sync with the movie, because that's what it's about. So Rick Benjamin, he is the artistic director, and he curates the music to go back to the historical scores. So he puts the scores together, and he is working with us. And you talk about being so precise with tempo, and rhythms. They have to be completely locked in. And honestly, it's changed how I practiced. Being much more cognizant of how you need to be in that group has really been great. And it's just one on a part. So I'm the only cellist, right? So you hear the word orchestra, but a theater orchestra can be just one on a part in this case. Theater orchestras back in the day used to be quite big, quite large, and actually larger than the New York Philharmonic at one point. So, it's definitely, there's a big tradition of this music. They have a 3-album called Black Manhattan composers. And so I'm on the 3rd album there, and they're highlighting these lesser known composers, but it's really interesting and great music. So this is really kind of broadened my knowledge of music that is out there historically, historic music that can be also brought to the classroom. So I've had Rick in the past arrange a piece for string orchestra, a Scott Joplin rag for a string orchestra in particular. And it's pretty hard for the first violin part, but again, it's interesting to see have students be playing this music that they haven't necessarily played before. Yeah.
Wow, outstanding. Well, thanks so much. This was a real education and inspiration. Lots of food for thought. And best of luck with all of these projects, the performing and the teaching related ones, and figuring out what is coming down the pike for the 21st century musician.
Yeah.
And I look forward to the next time our paths cross.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Caravan. Yep. And everybody out there, good luck practicing all this week. Happy practicing. We'll see you this time next Friday. Take care.